Dear friends, I want to sort of talk about the kinds of policies that the Australian Federation Party might be interested in. Uh, the first thing is that we are basically trying to get back the Australia that we have lost. That's the first step. And then we'll build another Australia that's even better. But the first thing is to get back what we have lost. And what we've lost is the government that speaks the truth. So as I mentioned in my video made a little while ago, there has never been a bigger scam than the lies that we've been told about COVID. We've never had a scam of this sort. I mean, people telling us lies that are 100 times or 500 times bigger than anything else we've experienced in our history. So, we know Morrison claimed that COVID is in the range of the Spanish flu. And we knew from the beginning that this is a very modest pandemic. There's been overwhelming data on that from the very beginning. All the models went wrong. And we know that it was never a big pandemic. And after 2 years, more than 2 years now, we have absolute no doubt about the fact that this particular pandemic is 50 to 500 times less lethal than the Spanish flu. So it's something a little bit worse than a seasonal flu. And for that, we've been put by these governments, these lying governments, into the deepest, trouble that man-made trouble that's been caused to this country, man-made harms. So is it too hard? How hard is it to get an honest government in this country? I mean, we've had 3 years of lies, and we will probably get another 3 years of lies, even if it's the Labour that comes in. That's not going to work for us. We need to get rid of these two parties and wipe out these parties and wipe out the lies from this country. We need a party that listens to the people. Now, I'll just give an example. I mean, everybody I know, there's a lot of people who made submissions to the local MP, the local representative, and everybody got a standard response which said, just follow what the government is saying. Nobody ever listened. None of the representatives listened to the people. Look at my example. I'll give my example. I wrote about this in a Financial Review, Australian Financial Review article on 16 September 2020. I explained why this is not a very big pandemic, and explained why all the policies are wrong, and I explained that the police state that they are creating in Victoria was a terrible way to deal with a public health issue. And so I had resigned my job as an economist in the Treasury. And while a few newspapers, etc., Channel 9, etc., they heard my particular thing, my views, Sky News, of course. But essentially, all the politicians brushed me aside. So they never heard what I'm trying to say. I had to resign to speak out, and they wouldn't listen even then. So then I wrote a book, The Great Hysteria and the Broken State. And guess what? Nobody listened even then. Then I went ahead with a lot more detail. It's a massive, detailed report, I spent 20 days making that report in November 2020, a complaint to the International Criminal Court. That is a lot of information. Nobody in Australia, among the politicians, was willing to listen to this. So what has happened is, we have had politicians who refuse to listen to the people, refuse to justify their totalitarian policy and stop these policies. And that's not going to happen with the Australian Federation Party. The DNA of this party is to listen to the people. The harms caused by this scam. This scam, basically the scam of telling us the biggest lies in Australia's history, it's not just Australia. Many other countries did the same thing, but except Sweden, of course, as we know. Sweden is the only country that followed its own plans and the approved scientific methods to deal with this pandemic. So, but there have been hundreds of cost-benefit analysis across the world, including in the UK, Canada, you name the country, there's been a cost-benefit analysis, some of them even within the governments of these countries. And all of them have proved that these policies, the totalitarian policies, caused much more harm than any benefit that we received from them. In Australia, there has been a small cost-benefit analysis by G.G. Foster and a few others sporadically, but now a big one is being worked upon by G.G. Foster, who's a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales. And I'm working with her. I'm supporting her in that project. The Draft findings are consistent with the CBAs of all other nations that lockdowns and border closures have caused vastly greater harm to Australia than any benefits we have received. The additional deaths have taken place, a vast number of additional deaths from non-COVID causes. People were made scared, they didn't go to the hospital. Then, of course, now we have an excess in cancer deaths and so on. The harm to children are so enormous because any benefit to the elderly is only for 2 or 3 years, let's say, or 5 years. What about the harms to children? Their entire life is, damaged, and that's what's happened to the children of Australia. Mental harms to the youth are enormous, and we can barely begin to count them. The births in Australia have fallen because, and each birth means we actually lose 80 years of life, effective life, and that's the kind of harms caused by this the scam. What we need is a freedom minister. We need a minister who ensures that there are no restrictions on freedom in this country unless there is a very strong justification through a cost-benefit analysis. And that means that the things like precautionary principle must go. I've written a lot about this in my book and elsewhere. We cannot have this ridiculous idea of a precautionary principle to go ahead and harm people. There is a thing, first do no harm. Precautionary principle means it must not do harm. What they are doing, what they have done is to cause enormous harm in the name of public health. These are the enemies of public health. This particular method, a precautionary principle, which also, by the way, is applied in many other areas such as the environment, it is very dangerous, this principle. It must go. Australian Federation Party is the only party that's committed to having a freedom minister. This is one of the biggest innovations in the world. I've written about such a proposal in my book many years ago, but this is the first time we're taking it to the people directly in Australia. We need to fix the harms caused by the lib labs. These libs and the labs have wiped out hundreds of billions of dollars in the wealth of the nation. They have sunk the economy into massive debt, $1 trillion plus. And how do we pay for this debt? Well, we need to do what these parties failed. They continued to have a bigger and bigger government. They had subsidies which they were basically using as, to bankroll their particular constituents or lobbyists, etc. It was a corrupt system. We need a small but focused government that just does its own job. We must not have the discretion given to politicians to dispense subsidies and grants. That's completely criminal because it is harmful to the taxpayer and it actually transfers wealth to the rich. We must, of course, ensure that regulatory burdens are slashed, particularly in town planning and environment. And I've done a lot of work in town planning, which is one of the worst in the world in terms of the restrictions imposed on development. We need to lower the taxes so that people can use their money for better and more productive purposes. And we must ensure that Australia diversifies its supply chains. We have been caught out because we are so dependent on China. That's not a good thing. We need to really diversify, and that's the kind of way to fix the harms caused by the lib labs. Sorry, my COVID is not yet 100% finished. So I'm having a bit of a cough sometimes and a bit of a cracked throat. We need to also undo the harms caused to our children and the youth. We must ensure that children are never masked, never ever again. We must ensure that no school is stopped or closed unless there is extraordinarily conclusive proof of harm. Sweden did not shut down its schools even for one day, and what was the harm caused to the children? Nothing. In fact, they benefited enormously. So we have had the worst policies for our children and the youth. We must never have this again. We need to undo the harms to businesses. Hundreds of thousands of businesses have closed down permanently. We need to ensure these businesses that they can start their business again and nobody will ever shut them down without a detailed order that will need to go to the court. In the court, there can be a justification if the government wants to close a particular business, but they cannot be broad brush lockdowns ever again. No, we will never allow our businesses to be shut down in a whimsical, ad hoc manner, arbitrary manner for the entire sector. We must have very targeted shutdowns if required, and those will have to be justified in the courts. We cannot have a system where chief health officers and others put out broad brush orders. And the Royal Commission on COVID, of course, I've written a lot about this in my book and also the manifesto of our Federation Party. We need a Royal Commission to bring to account people, the Lib Labs mainly, the chief health officers, and others who imposed colossal harms to the nation. I want to talk a little bit briefly, although this is not the main focus of my conversation today, about defense. I personally feel very sad that our defense arrangements are so shoddy in this country. We have had instead the opposite. People like Dan Andrews from Victoria undermining our defense. They are traitors to the country. These people have curried favors from China. Imagine a country like China. Just try to think about what's going on there. You see the atrocities, the complete destruction of human rights, the dissidents being locked up, the social credit system. This is the kind of country which people like Dan Andrews go and suck up to them. These are traitors to the country. They have harmed us. And there are others in the country as well. People who suck up to these kind of nations, the totalitarian nations. We need to get rid of them. We need to completely understand what's going on in our neighborhood. We need an ultra strong defense that cannot be breached by any nation without paying a very huge cost. And that could mean, and I'm not saying it will mean, it could mean a nuclear umbrella. We as a nation must become realistic. We cannot afford the luxury of depending on other nations, like the USA. Self-defense is the first and primary goal of our nation. We must not compromise on that, and we must not allow traitors to ruin the country the way they have. And of course, I want to sort of highlight a small little thing which came up one of these days in a conversation. There's a thing called multiculturalism, and I'm fine with all the multicultural things and cultural things that people do on their own, and that's fine. It's a social construct. By all means, have your own culture and so on. But I completely dislike, and detest and oppose the idea of the government funding different groups and paying them for their parties and so on. I oppose the government dabbling in any culture. That is not the business of government. The government job is to govern and not to go and do culture. We will not be interested in multicultural stuff. I don't want us to be funding any group, and we must stop this government dabbling in culture. Let people pay and support their own culture. And we've already had too much interference by bureaucrats in people's lives. Let's get the bureaucrats out of the hair of the people. Let us live our own life and our own cultures, and let's not go and beg government for subsidies and funding and grants and so on. So this, by the way, was a very short summary of some of the things that I would like to see happen in Australia. And I'll talk more about these issues in the coming days. Thank you very much.